Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Fergus Shanahan, and I'm delighted to be asked to launch this new initiative, namely a book, an electronic resource on the Nee-Mee diet. You're going to hear all kinds of lovely things. I mean, imagine something called the quinoa tabbouleh salad. I mean, anything with a name like that bound to be good for you. Couldn't possibly be bad for you. The Nee-Mee diet is based on solid science, and I've been aware of the science for some time. But it wasn't always that way. When I was a medical student in Dublin, we used to recognize a subset of the population, a large subset of the population, that we used to call tea and toasters. And you've all known about them too. You must have recalled an aunt or a grandmother or even your mother, and they would just take tea and toast all day long. And it was a tremendous remedy. And tea and toast is actually a real soother for an upset stomach. But they just brought it to a fine art and used to eat tea and toast all day long. And they were all constipated, every one of them. And we saw that as a fiber deficient diet. And medical science moved to the stage of partially replacing the fiber in their diet to alleviate the degree of constipation that they all had. Now, at the same time, um, probably the most influential speaker that I've ever heard and was privileged to hear was in 1976 when he visited Dublin. And this is just to show that a lot of this was grounded by an Irishman. Whenever I read people talking about healthy diets and good food, they almost all start by saying, quoting Hippocrates and saying, "Let medicine be let food be thy medicine." Now, in actual fact, Hippocrates never said that, ever. There is no evidence that he said any of the things that are attributed to him. It's all a nonsense. The story actually began with an Irishman, Dennis Burkitt. He wasn't the first to make a link between high fiber diets and health, but he was the one who convinced the world and convinced the medical profession, which wasn't an easy thing to do. And he was an Irish surgeon. He had track record. He had form as a skilled surgeon. Burkitt was the man who actually did highly detailed epidemiology in Africa and linked the distribution of malaria with a susceptibility amongst certain individuals, all in turn tracked with exposure to a virus. And Tony Epstein, um, who was a Nobel laureate, Tony Epstein said that when Burkitt came to speak in London, he was mesmerized with him, changed all the research in his lab because of something Burkitt said, and went on to discover the Epstein-Barr virus, all starting with good epidemiology, good old-fashioned clinical research. Now, most people would be thrilled to make a contribution to science once, but to do it twice, and he was the one, as I said, who popularized the notion of fiber. And he pointed out that with great wit and humor, pointed out that if you have small stools, you need to go to large hospitals, and had all kinds of double entendres that we as medical students loved, like hard in and soft out, all that kind of stuff. But Burkitt actually had rigorously defined epidemiology, and even though he didn't have mechanism, he didn't know why fiber was so important in a diet, but he did have the biologic evidence and the epidemiologic evidence. What you're about to hear tonight is actually the scientific underpinning, because we now know that fiber is really only code word for food for microbes. You don't need words like prebiotic, which was a word that was devised as some sort of dietary ingredient that vaguely allowed microbes, beneficial microbes, to grow. Actually, that can all be replaced. It's really just fiber of different types that can actually promote healthy microbes in your gut. And we now know that fiber is not just one entity, it's multiple different entities. And if you want to get a high fiber diet, you don't have to actually go and be reading labels all over the place, because fibers have their own tastes, just like we have. And they have individual tastes for different fibers. So the best way to keep them happy and well fed is to have a diversified diet. And you're going to hear about it tonight. And the best thing about it is it's free and that anyone could follow these recipes, but you must be motivated. So I'm now going to call on one of the scientists involved in this, my good friend Jens Walter from UCC. He'll speak first, and then you'll meet the second co-author, Jens.
Thank you very much, Fergus. This was a wonderful introduction. So I'm absolutely delighted to tell you the story about the Nee-Mee diet, to launch this book. And I'm delighted to introduce Anissa Ahmed to you, who is online in Alberta, Canada. I'm hoping it gets slightly warmer there. I don't know. It's whenever you have a remote meeting with Anissa, you never know if she is fighting minus 40 degrees at the moment, but it could be slightly better. Yeah. So I'm going to give you an introduction of the Nee-Mee story, and then Anissa comes in to tell you about how she developed the diet and the recipes. And then we're going to show you some of a summary of the clinical research that we've doing and what we actually found with this diet before we go back to Fergus, and happy to also then answer all the questions. So why would we eat healthy? I thought I'm starting with this slide because this is really what started motivating me, and it was also what motivated Dennis Burkitt that Fergus mentioned, because Dennis Burkitt was making his observations, for example, in colon cancer, and realizing, that a chronic disease like colon cancer is, way more common in the modern world than if you compare it, to rural Africa. And chronic disease is also what motivates me, and it's becoming a crisis, and the, several of these chronic diseases, and this here is a slide from the World Health Organization, they are reaching epidemic proportion. And if I talk about chronic disease, what I mean is diseases such as cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, strokes, certain cancers, colon cancer, and then also, diseases that are linked to obesity, like type 2 diabetes. You can see these diseases are now the major, cause for morbidity and mortality, also for death in the industrialized world. And these diseases are linked to diet. So we're very, very clearly know that we are predisposing ourselves to these diseases through the diet we are eating. And I think this provides really the motivation to, eat healthy. But then the next question is, how do we actually eat healthy? So we know it's food, but then, the controversies are starting. And obviously, if you go to the end, I got my fair share of this now, having a publication and being on social media and being in the press, it's very easy to get then all the attacks of the so-called diet experts, who tell you, that how to actually eat and have very strong opinions, on how to eat healthy. But then even if you go into the scientific literature, if you look and ask the experts, there are still controversies, there are open questions, is red meat healthy? Is it unhealthy? So there are, and actually even amongst our colleagues, we had heated discussions around it. Should you eat dairy? Should you eat cheese, for example? So these are the things that are, many open questions around. So, and what we did in the group is, we think, if you want to determine what is healthy, you have to think about that you are feeding your own body with diet, but you're also feeding all the microbes that are associated with your body. And you have as many microbes associated with your body, than you have human cells, and most of them are actually colonizing, your colon. And so this is a really important consideration, that this microbiome, which is linked to these chronic diseases, and we do know this from, good mechanistic research in animal models, that these interactions between food and the microbiome, might actually determine the effects, that the diet have. Yeah. Then another aspect of, that we like to look at is we like to zoom out, just like Dennis Burkitt did, and look at the, epidemiology of these diseases. And if you look at them, you actually see these increases in, essentially the last, 100 years. So they are very, very rare in non-industrialized populations. And then with, within the last, 150, 100 years, depending on the disease, they are actually increasing. Then in a country like China, which is industrialized 100 years later, it again starts with the onset of industrialization. And this is really, the basis for what we are doing, is as obviously something in the environment, something that we change, in the modern industrialized world predisposes us to these chronic diseases. And so this is something we really like to look at in the group. How does industrialization change the food, that we are eating? And this is something that is gaining a lot of attention at the moment. For example, for the interest in processed foods and ultra processed foods. But then also, how does industrialization actually change our microbiome? And this is really what brought me to Papua New Guinea, So, and I just wanted to tell you, the story that motivated me for this research, and it really goes back, when I was I still remember this. I was I think 8 years old, and there were these, documentaries about Papua New Guinea on the TV, and I was basically just blown away. It's a country, north of Australia, and it's dramatically diverse. It's 800 languages are spoken in Papua New Guinea, which is 1/3 of the world's languages. Some languages there are as different as English from China. You have these different tribes living in different remote valleys and very little contact to the industrialized Western world until the 1930s. Obviously, things like cannibalism helps. If you're an 8-year-old, and you look these documentaries, so there were, cannibalistic tribes up until the 1930s. That's something obviously we haven't, considered in our, diet very much. Yeah. So, but it helped for the fascination, as a small boy, and then in 2008, and this was when scientists are starting to ask the question, what are we doing to our microbiome, and how does an untouched microbiome work? I remember these documentaries and thought, why not study a microbiome in Papua New Guinea? And I was super naive about it. I really just wrote an email to a research institute. And seriously, within a few hours, I got introduced to this guy here and to Greenhill, who was at this research institute in the highlands in Papua New Guinea. And I basically just told him, I need poop samples, and I can do the research with poop. And they said, we have plenty of poop because we are studying, infections and pathogens in these, Papua New Guinean highlands. And these are pictures that Andrew provided. So you can see the Asaro mudman. You see the villages in which they live. It's a subsistence-based agriculture, and it's really interesting because it's an ancient form of agriculture. So guesses are that agriculture in Papua New Guinea goes back around 7,000 to 8,000 years, which means it's older actually than agriculture here within Europe, and it is still ongoing. Also in these rural places, people are growing their own food. You can see how they prepare. There's actually a lot of cooking being done in holes in the ground where, food is cooked with hot stones. Anissa is going to talk way more about the diet there, but then obviously other things, that interest us is untreated drinking water, little sanitation, home birth, breastfeeding up to 4 years of age. But antibiotics are actually quite common because infections are actually common. This is also something that's important. There is no reason to romanticize a non-industrialized lifestyle. Life expectancy is 65 years. So more than 10 years actually less, than we have in an industrialized world. Yeah. But it's important to think about, what people die from, and it is infection, and childhood mortality is high, and malnutrition is high. But then on the other hand, diet-related chronic diseases are extremely low in rural Papua New Guinea. And what is also interesting, obviously, Papua New Guinea is not trapped in time, so they are making a transition now to urbanization, to industrialization. And there's some really, really good literature on this showing that with this transition to urbanization, life expectancy goes up, malnutrition goes down, but also these chronic diseases are now creeping in. And type 2 diabetes actually went from 0 to 20% just within the last 20 years in these urbanized regions of Papua New Guinea. So again, providing, just a, motivation to really look how this, non-industrialized lifestyle, might be protected. I've been to Papua New Guinea. These are my own pictures. So these are these gardens you see. It's actually absolutely beautiful. You can see that it's just integrated in the culture, and everywhere where you go, you see actually people, having these gardens. And now more in recent times, individuals, sell these foods on markets. So this is something that probably only happened in the last 20, 30 years. But as you can see here, this is a market on an island called New Britain. You can see it looks like pretty healthy, foods, a lot of leafy greens. Meat is actually consumed, but much more rarely. And again, Anissa is going to talk more about this. Yeah, this was the market in Goroka in the highlands. And then obviously I also visited villages there, which is another thing. Obviously, diet is not everything in this non-industrialized lifestyle. So you can see these people obviously live very different. Actually, pigs are essentially a simple, status. Also they are very important. They are only being eaten at essentially festivities, but they live essentially with their animals under the same house. Yeah. And obviously we were interested in the microbiome. This is the publication from 2015, and just a few things. We saw that we found that was confirmed in many other studies. With other non-industrialized population, and Fergus's own work here on the Irish travelers, that we see a higher diversity in their microbiome. And we see, we think that this is linked with the dietary fiber. You also decrease the bacteria, for example, like with Prevotella, that we know actually interacts with dietary fiber. On the other hand, we see these blooms of bacteria in the industrialized world. And there's some good evidence, and there's even better evidence now with some of the modern studies, that they're clearly linked to the disease, to the diet we are actually eating. Interestingly, bifidobacteria in adulthood are actually more common in the industrialized world. Yeah. They are very common in these non-industrialized settings in youth, but then they actually go down. I'm actually not 100% sure why this is, but dairy might be a reason. And then we see all of these bacteria that we now clearly know are actually linked to meat consumption and saturated fat consumption. For example, this bacterium called Bilophila, that we see here almost 20-25 times higher in Americans if you compare this to these Papua New Guineans. And this is an interesting bacteria because it's clearly linked to inflammation in the gut and pathologies in animal models. Yeah. So if you summarize, and again, we are not the only ones. Fergus is working in this area and many other scientists. But if you look into what an industrialized lifestyle and likely the diet contributes to, you can see this, obviously, there's we have now this increase, in obesity. Also, so this, industrialized diet drives body weight, inflammation, cholesterol, blood glucose. But then in the gut, we see this drop in microbial diversity. We see lower amounts of fiber degrading bacteria. We see these pro-inflammatory bacteria, and then we see just less fermentation. And then a really interesting aspect is it seems like the microbiome in the modern world is basically focused on mucus, so it basically degrades the protective mucus layer that we have in the gut. While if you look into these non-industrialized populations, their microbiome is much more adapted towards plant-derived carbohydrates. So, and there are many, hypotheses that this is linked, to the increased risk of chronic diseases that we are seeing. And I would say that there's much research, in animal model of these pathologies, which is supportive, that these changes in the microbiome are in fact, contributing to chronic diseases. Yeah. So what we ask in the group, can we reverse some of this? Are these, effects, can we, reversible, and can we, to some degree restore microbiomes? And this is exactly where I would like to, bring Anissa in, to tell you, how she got involved and motivated in this diet, and how she actually developed the diet and the recipe. So Anissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jens, and good evening, everyone. It's afternoon here in Canada. It's not -40, but it's a bit close to that, and we just got another snowfall, so I hope the weather's nicer in Ireland. I also want to thank Fergus for that wonderful introduction, particularly focused on dietary fiber, and Dennis Burkett. Yeah, so it was just the perfect introduction to our study and why we are really focusing in on trying to restore the microbiome with dietary fiber. And to give you an idea of how the Nee-Mee diet was developed, I want to just quickly go over my own background, because it's what influenced me to then develop the recipes for the Nee-Mee diet. So In 2012, I was diagnosed with a form of inflammatory bowel disease known as ulcerative colitis. I was in high school at the time, so it was a fairly devastating diagnosis, but in working with a registered dietitian at the hospital, I was able to manage my disease for the most part through different medications and through changes in diet. But it's what's inspired me to become a registered dietitian. And so in 2013, I started my undergraduate degree in nutrition. And then in 2015 is when I started to post my own recipes to my Instagram account called Dash of Nutrition. I grew up in an Italian household, and so food was always at the center of absolutely everything. But now with this nutrition background that I had, I wanted to now start posting healthy recipes that people could take from my account and implement them in their own lives. My IBD, my ulcerative colitis, wasn't being managed very well through medication and small dietary changes alone. And so I chose to adopt a plant-based diet to try and manage my symptoms better. It was very successful. I was able to come off most of my medications, and I finally was in stable remission. And I have been really since that time, except when I defended my PhD last year, but that's completely unrelated to diet, and that was just stress related. But around that same time is when I attended a guest lecture from Jens, and then decided to enroll in his nutrition and gut microbiome course because of my own experience with ulcerative colitis, which has been really shown to be linked to changes in the gut microbiome. And after that course is when I asked Jens if I could work as a summer student, and particularly work on projects he had going on that were focused in on dietary fiber, as I became more and more aware of how important fiber was for the gut microbiome and our overall health. And I went back in my emails to find out when we first started talking about the Nee-Mee diet and designing it. And after being in the Walter Lab for almost a year, Jens introduced me to the group as someone that liked to create her own healthy recipes, and that I would be a good candidate to develop this Nee-Mee diet that he had envisioned for a clinical trial. And as part of that, my job was to look at what rural Papua New Guineans ate from Jens's previous research that he's already described, and try and get a sense if we could somehow replicate that in an industrialized setting. And using some sort of rudimentary information from this publication that Jens described, and understanding how non-industrialized societies ate, I took from that publication certain foods that were common in rural Papua New Guinea. I've just highlighted a few there that would also be acceptable in Canada. A lot of these foods are not available regularly or consumed regularly, so we wanted to try and get the best of both worlds, trying to mimic a non-industrialized diet, but also then creating something that would be acceptable by Canadians. And so from this list, we focused in on creating recipes with sweet potatoes, rice, leafy greens, beans, things like that. And then really focusing in on those sources of protein as well, pork, chicken, and fish. So like I mentioned, our goal was to really create a diet that mimicked these non-industrialized dietary patterns, but also mimic what we think our human ancestors consumed. And overall, we think that our ancestors consume relatively similar diets as to what these non-industrialized communities are still consuming, which are mainly plant-based diets that are very high in dietary fiber, mainly composed of vegetables, fruits, and legumes, with smaller portions of whole grains and small portions as well of lean animal proteins. Of course, these non-industrialized populations and our human ancestors really did not have access to processed foods. It's quite difficult to create a diet that is completely devoid of processed foods. while still being palatable. So we did include a few things more so related to spices and condiments and things like that. But for the most part, it was very limited in processed foods. And then finally, we excluded dairy, beef, and wheat products simply because they're not present typically in these non-industrialized dietary patterns. The second goal of creating this diet was to try and supply a high amount of the growth substrates of Lactobacillus reuteri. This was the microbe identified from Jens's research that was completely absent in the industrialized microbiome, yet was present in every single rural Papua New Guinean. And so we wanted to try and reestablish this microbe in an effort in restoring the microbiome as a whole. And so at the same time, we needed to provide a high amount of growth substrates like raffinose and stachyose, which are non-digestible carbohydrates found in plant foods such as beans, onions, peas, and especially in foods like Jerusalem artichokes, which if any of you have had them before, you will know that they do supply quite a high amount of growth substrates for your microbiome based on some of the symptoms you might experience after eating them. So after testing a few different recipes and creating a menu that would be able to be implemented in a nutritional trial, we've created this 4-day rotating menu with breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack recipes that really were very high in fiber, based on vegetables, fruits, and legumes for the most part, with one small portion of animal protein at the dinner meals in each day. So how was this diet actually tested in our trial? There are a few different ways you can test a diet intervention in nutrition research. We chose to go the route of a controlled feeding trial, which means that we provided all of the participants' meals and snacks for a defined period of time. And this diet was prepared in a highly precise and standardized way. We weighed out ingredients in the recipes to the 10th of a gram in this metabolic kitchen in the Human Nutrition Research Unit here at the University of Alberta. I spent the first year of my PhD basically cooking for anywhere from 4 to 8 hours a day, typically. But what this does is it allows us to really know exactly how much food we are giving participants. And then when they return their food bags that you can see on the left there, then we can actually know how much of the food they consumed. And this allows us to better understand exactly how this diet is contributing to any of the results we might see in our trial. And so this Nee-Mee diet was provided for 3 weeks, and we calculated each participant's energy or caloric requirements, and then gave them enough food to meet those requirements in an effort for them to maintain their body weight throughout the trial. So in this study, we had 30 healthy Canadians complete the trial. They were randomized to either start with the Nee-Mee diet for 3 weeks, or they continued to consume their usual diet for the first 3-week period. And then after a 3-week washout where they consumed their usual diet, they were switched over or crossed over to whichever diet they didn't start with. And then that ended with a final 3-week washout period. In a parallel arm design, participants were randomized to either an L. reuteri strain, which was PBW1, or the strain that was derived from rural Papua New Guinea, or DSM, which is the type strain derived from Europe, or a placebo. And on day 4 of each diet period, they received a high dose of either the L. reuteri or their placebo. And by giving them 1 dose, we wanted to see if the Nee-Mee diet could help reestablish this lost microbe in the microbiomes of these healthy Canadians. And then at the start and end of each diet period, we collected blood samples, and every 2 to 4 days, we collected stool samples as well. In this project, I was certainly not the only one involved. We had so many different collaborators involved as well. Fuyong Lee was the postdoctoral fellow in the Walter Lab at the time, and he was responsible for all of the microbiome analyses and coordinating the provision of L. reuteri in the trial. we had Dr. Carla Prado, who's a professor of nutrition and registered dietitian here. She was supervising the controlled feeding trial aspect of the study, and then a whole host of other collaborators that I don't have time to go through each one of them, but all of these contributions led to our cell paper, which I will let Jens describe in terms of what the results were of this Nee-Mee diet clinical trial.
Thank you very much, Anissa. So I'm just obviously the paper is open access. You are not just able to look at it, but it's also a 50-page document, I think. So thanks to Jessica Stanch, who's here, we have now these nice infographics, showing what we found. So this is I just give you a quick summary of what we saw. So this is the summary. So healthy Canadians, 3 weeks on this diet. So the first thing is they lost weight. And this is something that really surprised us because, as Anissa said, this was a calorie-controlled diet. They got exactly the calories they were supposed to get, and they still lost weight, and it was statistically significant. It was 1.4%. I think this is because if you eat these whole foods, the nutrient accessibility in these, plant foods and in these, cell wall structures that are intact in these foods are just lower. So we had a reduction of LDL cholesterol, which is the bad cholesterol, of 17%. So again, healthy individuals just for 3 weeks. And as you can see here, I think it's pretty fair to say that the diet is essentially really sucking cholesterol out of the system. Yeah, we have a reduction in blood sugar, of 6%. And again, this is highly significant. 0.001 p-value. Yeah. So then we looked into the gut, of course, and we were actually not able to reintroduce this Limosi Lactobacillus reuteri. And we also saw a drop in diversity, which is something that is, very, very, interesting and definitely not what we expected. So we're clearly not able to establish, a diverse non-industrialized microbiome. But what we could establish is we could increase fermentation, the short-chain fatty acids, which are very important. These pro-inflammatory bacteria, such as bilophila, were reduced, and then we could actually program the microbiome to be more targeting, plant-derived carbohydrates at the expense of mucus-derived, carbohydrates. We also see an increase in some beneficial metabolites like this indole-3 propionate, and I'm extremely excited about this because this is a metabolite that has been shown to be neuroprotective, and it's a risk marker, or it's a marker for low risk of type 2 diabetes. And there's actually just recent publications showing that this is probably extremely beneficial. And then what we also see, we see a reduction in harmful metabolites, such as secondary bile acids, for example, which are carcinogenic. So these are bile acids, that are produced by gut bacteria that have been shown to be at least correlated with colon cancer. So I think it's pretty, and I've presented this data on probably more than a dozen scientific conferences now. Never seen or never have gotten any pushback. So I think it's very impressive effects, which to a large degree actually exceeded what we expected. You could achieve, with a diet change of only 3 weeks. Yeah. So we, based on all this information, we are making now some dietary recommendations, and I'm not going into any details here because it is in the book, and as Fergus already mentioned, it's freely available for download. So please have a look. But as you can see, we are recommending, to actually push dietary fiber even to levels, that is higher what is recommended in nutritional, recommendations, because we used around 45 grams of dietary fiber. And we are also probably recommending to be very, very, sparse on, dairy that is high in actually saturated fat, which is really something I'm not saying lightly because I love cheese. Yeah, I'm sorry, I see people crying, and that's probably the hardest thing for me also to, follow this diet. But from what we see, this especially due to interactions with bacteria such as bilophila, this high saturated animal fat is probably very detrimental. So I leave it. We explain the principles in the book, and I'm happy to have discussions around them. Yeah. I added this slide because it's just important because I think it's fascinating to consider how much you can achieve actually with a healthy diet. So this is a paper published in 2023 showing, and this is an epidemiological study done in the UK, and it shows, that with a healthier diet, you can extend your life expectancy by 10 years. Unfortunately, no information on cheese here, because this is something that would actually have interest. But it really, as if you want one additional motivation to eat healthy, I think this is the publication. Yeah. And then I just wanted to, at this slide is because now obviously we know how to eat healthy, and actually Fergus and I, we participated in the Munster Gut Club, I think 2 weeks ago, and Fergus asked me in the evening, so what now, because we do know how to eat healthy. We know we should all be eating healthy, but it is really, really difficult to eat healthy, and it's very, very difficult to make people eat healthy. And I can't go into details, but there are publications obviously who look at these complex factors why it is so difficult. But then I had a few ones that I emphasize here. Knowledge. Many people, I am actually was one of them. When I was a teenager and a young adult, I had absolutely no idea what was healthy eating. I thought German cuisine was healthy, and it turned out it's really not. Yeah. So knowledge is a really important thing. Education. It's very hard to change your preferences. We are locked into our habits. These unhealthy foods are incredibly tasty. Our entire biology is really working against us, because we are craving these high-fat, high-sugar diets. Time is a really important thing. We are all busy. It takes a long time to cook these meals. And then money is important. It is actually more expensive, to eat healthy than to eat junk food. And I have this twice here because it's on a personal level, but we also on a societal level. We have to think the incentives, of food companies is essentially to just sell as much food, as possible, and not really, there is no incentive to really sell, healthy food. And this is, something where we try, we know well, that it's very, very difficult, and we know what we are up against, but, this is something where we at least try to contribute, through knowledge, through science, through scientific research. My research program here at UCC and the APC Microbiome Island is all around microbiome restoration. We're now thinking, can we, move this Nee-Mee diet also in clinical population, but we also, through collaboration with food science, for example, we are also thinking about making, industrialized food products more healthy. We are thinking about, putting or bringing some of these lost microbes actually back. And also through, collaboration. So this is a collaboration with João Mota in Brazil. We are now moving this Nee-Mee diet into clinical population. So this is a human nutritional trial actually in type 2 diabetes. And we are planning similar experiments, here in Cork with actually the collaborators, many which are here actually in the room. Yeah. Obviously, we want to make our small contributions. So this is why we made all the recipes freely available. You can find us, on social media. And then obviously this is also, the motivation why we are here. The book is also, freely available with all the information and all the recipes. I'm very passionate about trying to actually bring this into schools. So if you know teachers, people here in Cork, I think myself and others from the APC, and I'm sure Anissa would be more than delighted, to go into schools, talk with teachers, talk with children, to try and actually bring, healthy eating, into the schools. Yeah. Then time is a huge issue, and this is something I'm very excited about. We are starting to reach out to companies, to meal delivery service. So if things, and I don't want to take anything because Victoria is looking at me and she doesn't want me to spoil, the news, but we are talking with the company, and if things work out, the Nee-Mee dishes might be available for order and house delivery within the next 3, 4, 5 weeks. And this is something that makes me very excited because, again, it is one bottleneck of people not being able to eat healthy because they are just too busy. And then finally, money. And this is a huge thing, socio-economic, reasons. And these diets are not cheap. I try to follow the diet. It is definitely not cheap. And some people might just not be able to afford it. And this is really where I think, we have to think bigger. And this leaves my comfort zone entirely, because this is really, you have to think, into policy, how do we change education? How do we change the food system? But I wonder, if Ireland is one of the places in which you can perhaps achieve something like this, simply just, because it is smaller and everybody knows each other, which is actually, something that is helpful. And so this is a photograph here at the Alpharex, I think, what was it, 10-year anniversary. So you can see Michael Martin, who is the Taoiseach. I hope I pronounced this correct. So this, Anessa, this is the Prime Minister or something, of Ireland, sitting there happily next to Irene, my wife. So there is absolutely no way you would find a photo of me sitting next to Angela Merkel. Yeah. And I think this is an advantage, because, and we even know where he lives. So one of the next thing I might do is put the Nee-Mee diet book. And he has very, very good relationships with UCC and with the APC Microbiome Island, So I think these are really connections, that, so perhaps Ireland can serve, as a kind of microcosm, of healthy eating and how we can, implement this in a society. I know this is big thinking now, but at least, this is the hope. Yeah. So with this, I would like to thank you for coming tonight, for your attention. I would like to thank everyone involved, in this event, Fergus for emceeing, Victoria and Quiva for organizing, and all the other. Judy, who is designed all of our who's standing there, who's doing the filming and designed all our social media material. And I really would like to give a shout out to the Research Institute in Papua New Guinea, and also the people of Papua New Guinea that actually, whose culture inspired our diet that we developed. So thank you very much.